we're used to. Eagles played last Thursday against the Commanders. So would like to get some of your first thoughts on that Eagles victory. And for the first time all season, it seems like people can finally say they beat a team of note.
Yeah, I mean, I thought going into Cincinnati and beating Joe Burrow and the Bengals was pretty, and the way they beat him was a good win. But yeah, this was probably, I guess, the best team that they have played, aside from the opener against the Packers, and beat this season. So that is a positive. And they have a couple of tests coming up here the next few weeks, or the next 4 weeks, that could go a longer way in showing, the ability of their opportunities in the postseason and beyond.
What's the best thing you've seen since the bye week in the turnaround?
It's a good question. I just think it's what Nick Sirianni and Kellen Moore have done to the offense, and just kind of accepted who they were or who they are, and just became more of a run-based offense, and they haven't really gotten away from it. Maybe a little bit in Dallas in that first half, but sometimes the way defense is playing you will dictate how you want to call the plays there. But maybe a little bit, and also in the first half of the Washington game. But I think Saquon still had 15 carries. I mean, they still had Jalen, I think, dropped back 23 times. To me, that's too many times in the first half. But their willingness to do that and to stick with it, and to realize that this is the way that we have to go moving forward. Especially when you have, there can be some resistance to it, based upon how much you're paying your quarterback. Resistance to it when you have two receivers that are at quality, at the quality of an A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith. But Nick did in 2021 when they did the similar thing, this has kind of saved the season.
Jeff, has Bryce Huff bought into his role of, playing 30, 40% of the snaps, sometimes less?
I'm pretty sure that he's not happy he's not playing less, but I think the risk has certainly factored into why he isn't playing as much recently. I mean, it was kind of happening a little bit before that they weren't really playing much on rundowns on rundowns, certainly when they have the five-man front. They haven't really been playing much of the five-man front of late. So you've seen him not even out in those scenarios when you're expecting them to run the ball. But the rest of the factor, he's wearing a cast on it. But I think it's also just an indication that they just see him as a pass rusher. Like on obvious pass downs, when you get both feet in the ground, that's pretty much been his role. And it's not just him. Jordan Davis has had, his snaps cut into a little bit. You see him just primarily on run obvious downs, and that's played a factor in why the defense has played so well since the bye.
Saquon Barkley, he's been just, you almost can run out of adjectives to describe him. Do you believe that there are teams on there, like sort of in the future here, that are going to just say, we're not going to let him get his?
Eventually, that's going to happen. That happened a little bit the last few weeks, I thought. Certainly against Washington. I mean, they did a really good job of kind of bottling him up in that first half. And they're going to say, yeah, Jalen beat us. And Jalen, as we all know, has kind of been a little up and down, especially early in games. So, yeah, but there's sometimes, if you just say, hey, this is what we're running and try and stop us, we have a great offensive line. We have just mountain movers, especially on the left side with Jordan Mailata and Landon Dickerson. Yeah, just, we're coming at you and try and stop us. It's not just the O-line. Obviously, Saquon can get a lot of yards after contact. He's averaged 4 yards after contact since the bye. So, they're going to try and stop him, I guess, to some extent. But, if I'm the Eagles, I don't necessarily get away from it too much because, again, you have that offensive line and you have that running back and you have good run schemes with Jeff Stoutland devising a lot of them, coming up with new wrinkles so that teams aren't catching on to exactly what they're doing.
Jeff, Nick Sirianni said in his press conference yesterday about the longevity of the younger players, and he got into a whole point about physical practices during the week in between games, which is something that they did not do last year. I remember how many times you and your fellow reporters would point out that practice was like 6 minutes long. And obviously I'm being a little drastic there. But why the change for Sirianni? Is it he thinks he learned something new? Did the team tell him something? Is it Vic Fangio and his veteran presence? Like, why the big change for now midweek practices being more physical than years past?
I wouldn't go too far to say it's a big change. And they still have practices where they still have weeks when they just have walkthroughs instead of practices on those days. I think he's done a little more of it this season. And again, we saw in training camp too that they practiced a little more, they practiced a little harder, they practiced a little longer. Not drastic. They haven't really gone from one extreme to the other. It's just been a little bit, and I think that's what we've seen here in the season. And it's probably again, I think this is something clearly they addressed in the off season when you saw certain players wearing down last season. They thought that factored into the slide, into that collapse. And they stepped back. They got rid of Ted Rath, who was in charge of the sports science staff. They brought in someone new, and they said, "Hey, this is how we're going to approach this. We're going to do a little more." There's a couple of different philosophies when it comes to how you practice your players. The Eagles certainly had transitioned into one that said, "Hey, less is more." Then you have the Andy Reid school of thought. Rick Burkholder's his trainer. That school of thought is you train your football players like they're boxers, so you really work them out so that when game time comes around, they're seemingly equipped to take those blows because they've taken those blows or at least something equivalent to those blows during the week. But I think in today's NFL, the way players train, the way they're ready, and the way they're asked a lot more to do stuff on their own because the NFL the teams can only do so much because of the CBA and the restrictions that they have in practice. Teams feel like, okay, our players are ready. We just only need to do so much. But I think it's a little bit of a change. I don't think it's that much of a change.
A lot was made last year of the collapse, and maybe that the culture sort of fell apart a little bit for that team. Is it possible that the exiting of a Jason Kelce, that the exiting of a Fletcher Cox, and those two huge personalities, maybe lets the young guys feel a little more ownership and maybe a little more where they feel they can be themselves?
I don't think last year had a lot to do with an issue with the culture, to be perfectly frank with you. I think it was there were other things. I mean, certainly I think some of Nick's negatives, maybe we've seen him with the temperament and stuff like that. I think that kind of filtered down into the team. But I think for the most part, the culture that Nick has established has kind of allowed him to get through enough so that he returned last season, and then you've seen what it's done this season after a 2-2 start. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean that's a fair point to make. You can't replace a Jason Kelce. He's one of the greatest leaders since I've covered the team that they've ever had. So I don't think losing him was like good, for them in that regard. Fletcher was a different type of leader. Definitely not as vocal. Sometimes not as involved in that regard. But when he spoke, guys listened. So that there was that, and maybe sometimes I don't know if it worked to the way that maybe some of the building had hoped it would be done, and whatever. That I don't want to get too much into that, but. We've seen guys like Lane Johnson really step up into the vacancy that was left by Jason Kelce, Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson. Those three guys, played a role in Nick Sirianni and Kellen Moore being open to, I think they were going in that direction. But the fact that he had 3 other leaders on the offensive line come to you during the bye and say, "Hey, this is what we need to be," they listened to him, and that played a factor into it. On the defensive side. You're seeing guys like Reed Blankenship, for instance, that, not a lot is said about him, but I think behind the scenes, Reed's kind of developing to one of those quiet leaders and a guy that in that secondary will speak up when you have to. You always have BG still up front, and he kind of leads that group. And Slay has been there a long time. And I think a lot of guys look at him as the alpha dog in that secondary. But, yeah, there are a few guys, and as I said, primarily in the offensive line, that have really stepped up. And real quick, I think it's also allowed Jalen to take a little more of a leadership role a little more of a vocal role with no Kelsey, with no Fletcher Cox than he had previously.
Jeff, you're the man. We always appreciate our conversations with you on Tuesday. Can't wait to talk to you again next week.
Enjoy LA.
Yeah, have a safe trip out there, and hopefully the jet lag isn't too bad for you coming away home.
All right, guys. Appreciate it.
All right, there he is, Jeff McClain on the Comcast Business Hotline, where every day business is a big day. Let Comcast Business help you move forward with what's next. All right.